I was asked to do a very short self-introduction into the afternoon sessions. So this will be a rather sort of scholarly talk. So what is really fantastic in this event here, and I'm very thankful for being invited. A great thankful to Sophia and all of her sort of fantastic staff that set up this incredible event. So, as I already said, it will be a rather scholarly talk, so it is difficult after so many different formats to keep you still interested and engaged, but hopefully you will join. So I'm coming from the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. I'm there the head of the Academy department, so I'm engaged in a cultural heritage institution. That is on the one hand certainly fantastic, it's a museum, but at the same time, since its formation as a foundation, holds also postgraduate research programs, multidisciplinary, post-disciplinary research programs on the site. So meaning we are still a tiny little school, besides having many tourists and visitors also active on the site, and it's a constant learning and an intermingling of so many different audiences. Meaning if you are there, the Bauhaus is quite still an active sort of institution building. And this is so far very important, since the architecture of the Bauhaus building was meant to be a third pedagogue. So meaning when you are in, you immediately realize that this curriculum that's been set up by many figures, unfortunately, that this curriculum is, so to speak, manifested in the architecture. And you will sort of immediately also get engaged with this sort of a particular frame, which is more about teaching than about production, but it's about learning in the process of the making. And I got this invitation by Sophia as a researcher, as a teacher, as a curator, but mainly engaged with sort of narratives, historical narratives, also having a sort of an interest in anthropology. I thought how to engage with this particular learning environment of a botanical garden and to bridge it to some facets of the pedagogy of the Bauhaus. So that's what I'm trying to do. It's a more speculative narrative, or narratives in the plural, and I hope that I can contribute to this event also with a particular reading of Bauhaus historiographies, please, in the plural. In the archive of the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation, you might find a sketch by the Bauhaus student Reinhold Rossig, and I hopefully think with the screens it works, that you get at least a glimpse of the images I'm using here. And this sketch by this student Reinhold Rossig is kind of a response to an exhibition of Karl Blossfeldt's Archetypes of the Art at the Bauhaus Dessau in 1929. The popular neo-objective plant photographs stands in the context of a discourse in the 1920s that ascribed to modern media the ability, according to Moholy Nagy, I quote him here, to make visible the stream of life inaccessible to mere perception. Moholy Nagy's thinking was inspired by the biologist and philosopher of life, Reinhold Rossig. He has quoted him in his book, From Material to Architecture, which was, at least in those days, received as Moholy's pedagogical manifesto. Paul Klee, too, had been inspired by the archetypes of the art exhibition. In his watercolor, The Illuminated Leaf, he provides an insight into fictitious cellular microcosms. And just 1 year earlier, he was invited also to contribute to Hannes Meyer's inauguration brochure about young people joining the Bauhaus. It was a kind of an open call, where Paul Klee wrote, yes, one would have to appoint a philosopher in the end, a magician. One would have to hold classes on holidays, outside the school complex, outside under trees, how we did, with animals, by rivers or on mountains, by the sea. So it reminded me a lot on the activities within the ignorant art schools, sort of 12 hours Revel that we have today. These 3 episodes addresses facets of the controversies also taking place at the Bauhaus to redefine the relationship between technology, nature, culture, and society with divergent ideological premises, artistic attitudes. A growing awareness of the dangers to the environment and nature in the context of the dynamics of industrialization were also an important companion to the design and arts debates at the turn of the century. And you're all familiar with the garden city, settler movements, landscape protection, life reform. They all are not only counter-modernisms, but also argue with specific ecological ideas. Already here, questions of the relationship between architecture, artistic practice, urban development, environment, and nature became virulent. Based on episodes on Bauhaus artifacts, different paths and entanglements of the search for new artistic approaches towards the relationship between environment, technology, nature, and culture will be traced. And as I said, that's a bit speculative. After all, the social relations between nature and culture had changed radically in the beginning of the 20th century. And how did categories of environmental thinking emerge in the domains of design and artistic practice? And this can be even traced in a special way at the Bauhaus as part of a broad cultural reform movement in the context of interval modernism. With Schmidt's photography, Iris was inspired by Blossfeldt's book, Archetypes of the Arts. The exhibition of Blossfeldt and his publication stand in the context of a visual regime that has changed thanks to new media and tools such as microscopy and X-ray photography. And this radically expanded the limits of the visible. Not only the phenomena of nature, but their processuality and interwoven uniformity could now be explored. Modern media has been credited, and I flipped through some of the pages of Archetypes of the Arts, Urformen der Kunst in German. So modern media has been credited with the ability to reveal the hidden unity of the world. With that, a liberation from the fragmented reality would be possible. Moholy Nagy took up Rossig's concept of biotechnology with his formulation of the biotechnical forms. So he was very impressed by Francais' idea of a process mechanics that determined all areas of life and things, nature and culture alike. And without going here into detail about the epistemologies of unity of knowledge in the 1920s, theoretical positions of the so-called life sciences formed here an important framework. And in Francais, the plant as inventor, German, die Pflanze als Erfinder, in 1920, he traces the energetic principles of design inherent in urban forms, in natural forms, and asserts analogies between structural formation of plants and that of technical inventions. So modern technology, according to Francais, follows the construction principles of nature, a position that continues the architectural and design debates on biomimicry across the whole 20th century. Francais understood his work as a life theory, and that brings people, nature, and technology together again in a phase of a modernity without form. At its core, Francais' ideas of synthesis aimed to reconcile nature and technology in a new way. So new imaging technologies, as I already said, like photography, film, microscopy, allowed a new seeing in the combination of new scientific visualization technologies and debates around nature culture. The idea of a now visible continuum is formed that balances the fragmentations of modernity and spheres previously understood as opposing each other, such as that between nature and technology. Educational films in the 1920s, like the growth of the crystalline, I don't have an image unfortunately here, which was already shown publicly at the opening of the Bauhaus building on the 4th of December 1926, is just as much in that context of this biotechnological discourses as the rather popular film Blumenwunder or Flower Miracle. So beyond the visible, plant photography, and this is just also an interesting example of how female photographers at the Bauhaus got engaged with plant photographies. Yeah, and then a few examples of how influential actually this exhibition on the archetypes of the art were. This, you can really read through reviews, and you might be also astonished what kind of titles were at work. For example, plants, how plants feel, or green architecture. So it's a continuation, and then even there you find also analogies between, so to speak, natural forms and then a typical sort of primitivist discourse perception towards sort of vernacular architecture. So beyond the visible, plant photography manifests a way of representation that suggests to the viewer that he or she can control nature in a quasi-optical way. Unordered fragments of nature are brought into a pictorial order. The liveliness of the form of sections of nature is given structure comparable to botanizing in herbarium. Blossfeldt's photographs move between this span as speaking patterns of a liveliness articulating itself in nature and as a pictorial mute expression of a fictitious analogy of artistic primordial creation encoded in plant forms. They stand for an image nature reproduced by technology. So the second scene I'd like to look at is again a sort of shifting perspective, and I'm citing here on Walter Benjamin's critique on the archetypes of the arts in his article News About Flowers, German Neues von den Blumen. And Walter Benjamin claimed that in plant photography, completely new pictorial worlds and analogies could be found that had long interested painter Karl. After all, he compared the plant shoot to a gifted dancer. Reminds me of the morning performance we had. Karl, the first editor of Blossfeldt's work, had already claimed something comparable, and quoting here, even the dance, a human body that has become art, finds its likeness in a bud of touchingly childlike gesture and an expression of the purest mental tension. So plant photography proved the haptic dimension of the visual and was therefore considered a school of seeing. It was not about the content of the image, but about the sensual experience of the movement of the forms and the plastic rhythm of the composition. Not only the great success of the plant forms, as I already said, the flower miracle, dancer Neddy Impekhoven transferred the growth of a flower into dance movement in a time-accelerated shot. And what was literally demonstrated here, the receptivity and resonance capacity of the human body, was then also of central importance, here's the bud again, was also of central importance to the stage workshop at the Bauhaus. So space, movement, rhythm, vibrations. The aim of these workshops was also to evoke new ways of looking at things by creating new rhythm movements. And Karl here together with Paul, work was also to evoke these new ways of looking at things, creating new rhythms of movement. So she brought from the Palukka school in Dresden the self-understanding of dance movement that, with Adolf Appia or Uta von der Bahn, had already influenced the life reform movements in the beginning of the 20th century. And community experience was based on rhythmic resonance that synchronized the individuals into a community that was based on receptivity and vibrational capacity of the human organism and not on rational agreement. Movement transformation energetic discharges were seen as an expression of the hidden energetic processes. And here, as a direct knowledge, new inwardness, cosmic thinking, this new seeing, return to nature and modern technology have met without being irreconcilable opposites. So this will be the last scene, and then I have a little wrap-up. So the watercolor made by Paul Klee, Illuminated Leaf, that I have shown already in the beginning, not only reveals a possible reference by Paul Klee to Blossfeldt, so this exhibition of the archetypes of the arts, but also documents the painter's preoccupation with biomorphic structure. And in contrast to many of his early depictions of plants and animals, in which Klee imagined something like surrealist archetypes of plants, here it was much more about the understanding to convey the processual nature of pictorial design and to illustrate this with concrete examples from nature. So Klee tries to overcome imitation of nature through simplification. And more important than nature, and its study was the emphasis on the movement of the pictorial means. The artist was not interested in realities at the end of form, but in the formative forces in the process of creation. So the growth process in nature served as a model for the mediation of the creative. And so Klee was sort of engaged in the inner structure and its development. In his teaching, he tried to convey the creative processes with the artistic process of creation. So it was not nature that was decisive for him, but his own engagement in the creative line. The line became a cipher for liveliness, which is reflected in particular in his educational sketchbook. And now I'm summing up, hopefully I'm in time. So how shall we sort of continue to engage artistically and culturally, as designers or architects, with plans? Botanizing, visual analyzing, photographing, drawing seems all problematic. A modern practice with its problematic epistemologies, as Michael Marder claimed in his analysis of the metaphysics of the herbarium. And I quote Michael Marder here: "We say that we gather, then when we irreparably cut the connection to the soil and the rest of the plant body, we castrate. I called herbaria silent holes, frozen, suspended in time and space, cut off from lived durations and habitats." So the archetypes of the art by Blossfeldt and its resonances at the Bauhaus might illustrate this modern metaphysics in which nature could be, in this case, optically controlled. But is there still something viable in this early 20th century engagements and critical conceptualizations of nature in light of its impending destruction? Contemporary thinkers like the Scottish Tim Ingold took up the thread of that complicated legacy of ecological thinking. In his essay, Bringing Things to Life, Creative Entanglements, he refers to Paul Klee's notebook, where the painter Paul Klee repeatedly insisted and demonstrated by example that the process of genesis and growth that give rise to forms in the world we inhabit are more important than the forms themselves. Form is end, death, he wrote. Form giving is movement, action. Form giving is life. Ingold's reference to Klee is less engaged in his aesthetic theory, but introduced in the context of a critique of notions like the environment as something out there, as something made out of objects as fixed entities separated from the processes of life. So Ingold instead insisted on life as a generative capacity of an encompassing field of relations within which forms arise and held in place. So what I cite him here: to read things forward entails a focus not on the abduction but on the improvisation. Thus, when I speak on the entanglement of things, I mean this literally and precisely, not a network of connections, but a meshwork of interwoven lines and movements. So from these propositions, the possibilities of being in the world are opened, and education is evidenced as mobilization of attention, putting in check theories of transmission of culture and the human formation based on the opposition, such as mind and body, nature and culture, and this is exactly what we're doing here. In this way, we are faced with a radical ecological perspective that symmetrically thinks of place and the status of organisms and their agencies in the world on an equal shift. So this is a shift from viewing a phenomenon as being, so what it is, to a phenomenon in its forming, what it could become, from ontology to ontogenesis. I thank you very much for your attention.
Is there any responses or questions? Regina, would you like to take questions?
Sure. Any questions or responses? I'm happy to get into a dialogue. Yeah, sure. Looking forward.
Yeah. So thank you so much for shifting away from the kind of endpoint of form to the kind of unfolding of different kind of processes of form, and then that kind of call for an expanded kind of attention. And I guess I just wanted to think about that in the moment where we are, where there's so much disruption of the very possibility of an unfolding form, you know, because parts of the world that might meet that form are missing, you know, through things like extinction and habitat change, but also where there's lots of kind of, like, potentiality is important, but latency and loss and not happening or lying in potential in quite toxic ways. We're grappling with all that now too, and I mean, it's so interesting to go back to that historical moment of the Bauhaus, but I wonder if you can speak.
Yeah.
A little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, what is always fascinating is once one had a sort of a particular lens driven by our contemporary concerns, that you might even detect in this particular historical moment of the 1920s, which was, I mean, comparably shaped by so many sort of uncertainties, crises, and sort of ruptures, taking also the experience of the First Global War, the First World War into consideration, the sort of dramatic transformation of landscapes, the extractivist logics that has taken place within colonialism, but also then sort of in sort of the northern hemisphere that's driven by industrialization. So I think so this search for alternative models of thinking and epistemologies, which we sometimes look at with a certain sort of irony, but then finally one realizes also there is still something to learn from or could be detected in a particular way. So these new dialogues that are shaped nowadays might sort of also again learn from it. You mentioned in the morning Uxil, this was also an interesting thing, with all of its critical sort of positions they shared, and also some racist theories behind. So it is complicated, and I would not claim that there's something we need sort of to immediately take up. But I think there were some threads where we share with our companions from the 1920s, and one can build on. And then it depends on the way how we, for example, as a cultural heritage institution, can create new modes of reading, new narratives that can also build those kind of engagements in cultural, artistic, and design projects with our contemporary concerns, and so far also trying to bring up this heritage in a more sort of in a much more recent perspective. And the second, what you were asking for, it is certainly it's very abstract, and it's certainly about epistemes. So the way how our thinking is shaped, and I think that is something what I think in Ingold's thinking even toxicities are part of. So it's not out there, but rather it's thinking, and that creates also all of actually what is part of our sort of processual environment, and so it's not out there, but it's also part of it. We have to get engaged with it.
Thank you. I think we had a good sleep in between as well. So, just reflecting on that, we talk about the dynamic chaos, the change. I think it's repeating again, but instead of it, in Bauhaus as an inspiration, it also focused on the functionality, however small or big it was. In the various domains.
Yeah, I should have started with that. I mean, we have a sort of the dominant narrative about the Bauhaus historiography is shaped by this idea of a completely artificial environment. It's been created by the Bauhaus, that's embracing the new opportunities of industrialization, mechanization, standardization. But this was a constant struggle within the institution, and I think Clay is certainly one of the most interesting figures among them. Even though I could have done also a lecture on the weaving workshop, so I think you would immediately see an ecosystem of the weaving workshop. It was struggling around all of these different facets of making, getting hands dirty, getting engaged. So this is less about, the smooth surfaces and sort of the tubular steel frame chairs, but it's the ugly underbody of the Bauhaus, and that is much more interesting nowadays with all of its transcultural entanglements, what Bauhaus Imaginista did perfectly, and I think my colleague Grant Watson will talk about it later on. So yeah, I'm not drawing a picture of the Bauhaus that fits into the international styles victories on this northern hemisphere, but rather interested in alternative narratives. Yeah. And I mean, this is also an invitation to contribute to this alternative narratives, and not just focusing on what we all know about.
And also, I think, so just a little bit of response to that, when we showed the Bauhaus section at the City No. 2 exhibition of the Ignorant Arts School, we didn't focus on any design achievement, but we focused on the experience, learner's experience, which is exactly inspired by Gropin's Bauhaus manifesto, when he said that, his aim for Bauhaus is absolutely not the style, the canon, but it's actually the changing life itself. So I think that says a lot about the intention of Bauhaus. Of course, how the idea or the perception of Bauhaus being developed because of the market-led economy, all sorts of political, social elements around it, and shapes how we understand Bauhaus. But sometimes, as earlier we said, maybe we should go back to the history to revisit the ethos, the original ethos of Bauhaus. I think it's more pertinent for today's how we set up relationships between us and the world, how to be with the world rather than be in the world, how we make friends with the world, with each other.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophia. And just to add, it's a little quote from, there was a survey in 1928 among Bauhaus students, so a typical survey, but also this takes place actually in contemporary universities, and this survey was published in the Bauhaus magazine, and when you read this survey, you will be astonished how critically, how self sort of active and the students were, so it looks super contemporary. And I just want to cite one of the students' voices, Otti Berger, super famous weaver later on. She was killed in a concentration camp, and she was asked what brought her into the Bauhaus school and why she has decided to become a student and where she came from. And then she said, I came from a school of dead conventions. And what she meant is that it was about a school, so this kind of decorative art school. So and she named that convention school. And then in the second step, she was asked what she's expecting from school, and she said, I want to get rid of my old self. This old self is very problematic, so the way how I was shaped. And then the third, what she's expecting was to learn how this new self sort of started walking. And I think the morning discussions also about sort of the future art school reminded me a lot on those kind of, ideas and yearnings for alternative ways of art school teaching. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.